Welcome back, everybody, to Political Ideas for A-Level Politics for the AQA specification. What we're going to do in this video is talk about the core ideas of socialism. This being one of the major elements of our understanding of socialism, we're just going to sort of cite and highlight some of the core main elements of socialist ideology before we start to talk about the various different kinds of socialism, the way in which socialists understand economic policy, things like labor theory of value, things like the concept of alienation, the idea of social policy and society under the auspices of general socialist philosophy, as well as other things like the state and the individual, for example, all of which are going to be issues that we're going to talk about in future lessons. So, the previous lesson looked at how we could define socialism, as well as examine some of its earliest developments. We'll talk in this about more details relating to socialism, the kind of socialism that we are going to be discussing for the majority of these lessons. We're not talking about Fourier and Owen's sort of utopian socialist ideas. We're talking about ideas of socialism that are developed and sort of formulated, at least originally, by the likes of individuals such as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, of course being the kind of socialism that we are all familiar with to this day. So the first core idea related to socialism pertains to this idea of material goods and their distribution. Socialism looks to the focus on the nature of material goods. This includes the equitable distribution of goods and resources, as well as the equality of resource distribution too. Now, this is something that is almost a result of socialist thinking, rather than necessarily being the primary driving factor of socialist thinking. Fundamentally, what socialism looks to examine is the relationship between the worker and the products of their labor. We note in an understanding of socialism that fundamentally what socialists argue, what Marx and Engels argue, is that where there exists the people who own the means of production, and where there are people who exist who work to establish the means of production, the taking of the labor that was that is created by what is known as the proletarian class creates a sense of alienation in the minds of the proletariat. They argue that essentially there is value that is put into the the value that is put into the goods that are created by laborers, and that the taking of that value and selling for profit by people who own the means of production creates a sense of alienation. You are alienated from your labor, and this is seen as something of a general historic wrong and an immorality that exists. And so the means of production are said to be argued to have had to be taken by the proletariat, and the ownership has to be removed from that of the bourgeois class. We'll get to this in more detail as time goes on, but this is just fundamentally the bedrock of what we understand to be the ideas of socialism and Marxist philosophy. We're talking about the idea of alienation. We're talking about a state of alienation that leads to a class consciousness, which then leads to the desire to rise up to essentially try and improve their material conditions. And with this idea of class consciousness, we have this idea of collective action and collectivism, working as a collective. Society is enhanced by collectivization, since it enhances greater economic action. Again, something which is a core idea in socialism, something that had been attempted by various communist states in history. Stalinist Russia, for example, as well as Maoist China, both attempted to create a state of collectivization. There is also views that relate to the socialist understanding of the state. Now, the concept of statism is a controversial idea within socialist ideology. The idea of belief in the existence of the state, or belief in the necessity of the existence of the state. Marx himself was not a statist, and this is supported by various different cases within his writings. He believed that when there is a transition from the dictatorship of the proletariat into a fully socialist state, things like the state itself, the idea of the structure of the state and the idea of the structure of law would actually just start to fade away, because it becomes meaningless. It becomes something that does not require is not necessary for the requirement and for the maintenance of society. And so the result of this is that Marx himself was not actually a statist. And when we talk about dictatorship of the proletariat, what we mean here is that the proletariat taking control of the means of production. And by dictatorship, we just mean control. Dictatorship, under the sort of language that was utilized by Karl Marx in the 1800s, has sort of different connotations to dictatorship to this day. Of course, dictatorship today refer to often single leader with quite totalitarian and oppressive ideological foundations. This is something that isn't exactly described by Marx to be the case. Other socialist thinkers, however, argued that the existence of the state and the maintenance of the state is important for the upholding of socialist ideals. People like Marxist-Leninists and Lenin himself believed that socialism could be achieved through the utilization of nationalization, arguing that the state is a democratically elected institution, and so taking control of the means of production under the auspices of the state represents a taking of control of the means of production by the people. Hence why there is a quite strong and large state that existed and quite a lot of control by the state that existed under the Soviet Union. So the concept of class is also a very important element within socialist society. Class plays a central role in terms of relations in society. And what Marx does in his understanding and conception of class is take from the writings and the philosophy of people like Hegel. Marx himself, in fact, was a young Hegelian, along with individuals such as Feuerbach. And one of the things that is taken and utilized and ran with within Marxist theory that is taken from Hegel is this idea of dialectical materialism. Now, Hegel believed in this idea of dialectics as a way of being able to explain certain dynamics and relationships, a dialectic being simply two opposing forces, like a yin and yang, if you will. Marx argued that class was dialectical in a similar way, where you have the sort of owners of the means of production and the workers of the means of production, and that these sort of existed in a state of opposition, always sort of yin and yang, and this is what leads to this idea of materialism and dialectical materialism. We're going to get into this when we start looking at historical materialism, what Marx believed to be the sort of explanation for how history develops. And essentially what historical materialism explains is that history is just basically a story of class dynamics and class dialectics that go back and forth. This is something we'll get to in future lessons. But for now, this just concludes the sort of basic core ideas of socialist thought.